This is the 37th time I have spoken to you from this office. Throughout the long and difficult period of Watergate, I have felt it was my duty to persevere. I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first.
The biggest White House scandal.
5 people have been charged with breaking into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee.
Presidential press secretary called the incident a third-rate burglary.
Nixon's life had Shakespearean overtones. He achieved great heights, but he's ground down by his own flaws.
The Watergate scandal broke wide open today.
He was as smart as a whip.
He would not quit.
The president has a responsibility to defend this office, which I shall continue to do.
There was an effort made to somewhat contain the investigation.
The cover-up had already begun, and Nixon was doomed.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Nixon was shy. He's dogged.
Patriotic.
Visionary.
Nixon is this mass jumble of conflicting qualities.
Competent.
He was shy. He was awkward.
He could be a very kind person.
Could be insecure.
Suspicious. You could just feel his compassion, in a good sense.
Nixon came from very humble origins in Southern California.
Just a little old house, not pretentious, just something that everyday people, where they would live. That's where he grew up.
When Nixon was a young boy, his little brother died. When Nixon was 18 or 19, his older brother, Harold, died.
Dick just picked up the mantle at that point, and he was the eldest son and destined to become the leader in the family.
Nixon, from a very early age, seems to have been drawn to public service.
Service through politics is the way to go. Dick picked it up because he was a student of history. He just loved it. And Pat Nixon was the one that really, a new spirit in the family. Competitive, loved to laugh.
Nixon understood himself to say that he was an introvert in an extrovert profession.
Nixon was not a natural. Nixon had to learn and study and work for every step he was able to take to the pinnacle of American politics.
Nixon spent his whole life winning and losing and coming back.
He was a relentless fighter.
Not 1 cent of $18,000 or anybody else.
I am a man who is aggressive. I am a man who will not tolerate the things I believe in.
And there was something admirable about this. He was not a quitter. I'm not a quitter.
I don't believe that I ought to quit, because I'm not a quitter.
He had been in the House of Representatives. He had gone on to the Senate at a very young age. He'd become vice president before he was 40 years old.
Perseverance is why he could come back from the defeats.
John F. Kennedy defeated GOP standard bearer Richard Nixon.
I think he started figuring out how he was going to get back into public life right away.
What should I call you?
Jack, I wouldn't really worry about that. I've been called everything.
When Richard Nixon lost the governor's race in California in 1962, the reporters thought he was finished.
You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore. Because, gentlemen, this is my last press conference.
But the thing about Nixon is that he never gave up. He never quit.
Nixon will announce within the next week that he will run again for president. Not so much that he will run again, it's that he has never really stopped.
Richard Nixon was the biggest loser in American politics, and 4 years later, he was raising his hand as President of the United States. People could not believe it.
I, Richard Billhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear. In these difficult years, America has suffered from a fever of words. We cannot learn from one another until we stop shouting at one another.
Richard Nixon was taking over the presidency of the United States during the greatest social, moral, cultural crisis and division in the country since the Civil War.
You had the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy.
Full integration in the South, it's still not happening.
Our families were coming apart by a war that we didn't fully grasp.
When Nixon became president, there were 500,000 Americans in Vietnam.
Nixon saw youth and others mobilized around an anti-war movement.
I respect your idealism. I share your concern for peace.
He promised the Americans to get the United States out of Vietnam, and I think many people hoped that he'd be able to do it. The problem, of course, was how to do it.
And one cannot end a war by simply walking out of it as an American strategy.
The president was determined to end the war on an honorable basis. But there were certain controversial decisions he had to make.
I would rather be a one-term president and do what I believe was right.
Nixon was conservative in many ways, but he was an activist.
It's Richard Nixon, many would be surprised to know, who puts into place the Environmental Protection Agency.
To make reparations for the damage we have done to our air, to our land, and to our water.
He was very strong on affirmative action. He was determined to increase the number of women in senior positions around the government.
Assistance to black colleges, assistance to minority businesses.
He created OSHA. He had the first welfare reform legislation.
Southern schools were desegregated under Richard Nixon to a degree that dwarfed anything beforehand.
He really feels that Native Americans have been treated very unfairly in this country, and he wants to do something about it.
For 700 years, the Taos Pueblo Indians worshiped in this place, and we restore this place of worship to them for all the years to come.
He had an uncanny sense of what the American people were thinking.
And at the end of his first term, the American people had rewarded him with a 49-state landslide.
Nixon was a great intellect. He had a capacious mind, and writing was a way for him to formulate his thoughts.
Late at night, he would go to his hideaway or to the Lincoln sitting room, and he would sit there for hours making notes.
I don't know how many thousands of yellow pads he went through in his lifetime. He was at work early. He stayed late. He was extraordinarily disciplined.
His nickname in law school was Iron Butt, because he could sit there so long and study.
He was always willing to work harder than the next guy in order to achieve more.
Nixon had a vision of peace based on a long and deep study of international relations.
No one comes close, in my opinion, to Nixon's grasp of foreign policy and his strategic approach.
When the communists took over in China, Mao made a very famous speech in which he said China in the Cold War would lean towards the Soviet bloc.
This is at the height of the Cold War, when we feared the Soviet menace.
There can be no stable and enduring peace without the participation of the People's Republic of China and its 750 million people.
The president felt that if we started doing business with China, we would get the Soviet Union's attention. He said, I'm going to go to Peking and I'm going to go to Moscow.
Peking, historic site for an unprecedented meeting between East and West.
That handshake went out all over the world, and it sent a tremendous message.
For an American president to be sitting there in Beijing talking to Chairman Mao This showed that something had changed.
Nixon was in his element with world leaders. He could discuss issues of peace on the basis of common objectives.
He goes to the Soviet Union, first president ever to go to Moscow. He personally negotiates an arms control treaty.
We shall sometimes be competitors, but we need never be enemies.
Nixon provided a vision for peace in which all significant countries could participate.
The President of the United States had been walking on the wall of China. The President of the United States was walking the streets of Moscow. We now hear when a statesman does something bold,
Or something courageous,
Visionary, transformative,
something dramatic,
Someone you don't expect.
Complete surprise.
historically important, which changes world politics forever.
they call it his Nixon to China moment.
Nixon said he wanted to be remembered as a peacemaker, but I think he wanted to be remembered as a servant.
Nixon lives for 2 decades after resigning the presidency in 1974. And against all odds, Richard Nixon becomes a valued advisor to Ronald Reagan, to George H.W. Bush, and remarkably, to Bill Clinton.
He was a statesman who sought to build a lasting structure of peace.
5 presidents attend his funeral. And Clinton urges in his eulogy for people to judge Richard Nixon on the entirety of his political career.
He had so many ideas.
He put the prestige and power of his office on the line to make sure that things would go forward in America.
He had, in my opinion, very clear goals to leave this country better than he found it. And I think that propelled him.
History is made by humans. Nixon was intensely human. He did have flaws, but his very ability to overcome those flaws, to fight against his fears and his weaknesses, gave him a kind of power and drive that led him to do great things.
The greatness comes not when things go always good for you, but when you take some knocks. Because only if you've been in the deepest valley can you ever know how magnificent it is to be on the highest mountain.